Cast your minds to a moonless night in the year 1782. The merchant vessel Seahawk cuts through the inky waters of the North Atlantic, her wooden hull creaking against the gentle swell. Captain Edmund Blackwood stands at the bow, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he peers into the darkness ahead. The sea stretches endlessly before him, a vast mirror reflecting nothing but the star-pricked sky above. But Captain Blackwood knows, as do all who make their living upon these treacherous waters, that beneath this deceptively calm surface lurks a world of unimaginable terrors, a realm where logic surrenders to legend, where science bows before the supernatural, and where the very ocean itself seems to pulse with malevolent life. Suddenly the ship shudders, not from wind or wave, but from something far more sinister. The captain's blood runs cold as he feels it, a presence beneath them, something vast and ancient stirring in the abyssal depths. His crew, seasoned sailors all, gather at the rails with wide eyes and trembling hands. They have heard the tales, passed down through generations of seafarers, whispered in taverns from Portsmouth to Port Royal. Tales of creatures so immense they could drag entire fleets to watery graves. Beasts so terrible that their very names are spoken only in hushed tones, lest speaking them aloud somehow summon their wrath. These are the legends of the sea monsters, the ancient terrors that have haunted humanity's relationship with the ocean since our ancestors first dared to venture beyond the safety of shore. Welcome, brave souls, to a journey into the deepest, darkest corners of maritime mythology. Tonight, we shall dive beneath the waves to encounter 12 of the most fearsome creatures ever to emerge from humanity's collective nightmares. From the tentacled horror of the Kraken to the biblical might of Leviathan. From the whirlpool-dwelling Charybdis to the soul-stealing colossal of the Arctic ice. These are not mere fairy tales, dear viewers. These are the shadows cast by our deepest fears, the manifestations of our ancestral terror of the unknown depths. Each creature we shall encounter tonight has shaped cultures, inspired literature, and driven brave men to madness. They are the guardians of secrets that the ocean refuses to yield, the keepers of mysteries that science has yet to solve. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a voyage unlike any other. For once we begin this journey into the realm of sea monsters, there is no turning back. The abyss, after all, has a way of staring back into those who dare to gaze upon it. Let us begin our descent into legend. Let us journey back to the frigid waters off the coast of Norway, where the midnight sun casts an ethereal glow across the choppy sea. It is here, in these treacherous northern waters, that we first encounter perhaps the most infamous of all sea monsters, the Kraken. Picture, if you will, the year Captain Lars Eriksson commands the whaling vessel Storm's End, a sturdy ship crewed by the hardiest men the North Sea has ever known. These are not men easily frightened. They have faced down charging sperm whales, weathered hurricanes that would send lesser sailors to their knees in prayer, and navigated through ice floes that could crush a ship like an eggshell. But today, as Captain Eriksson peers through his spyglass at what he initially mistakes for a small island rising from the depths, his hands begin to tremble. The island is moving. Worse still, it seems to be breathing. By Thor's hammer, whispers his first mate, Bjorn Ironson, a giant of a man whose courage has never before been questioned. Captain, that's no island. As they watch in growing horror, massive tentacles, each thicker than the main mast of their ship, begin to emerge from the water around the creature's central mass. The sea itself seems to recoil from this ancient presence, waves forming strange patterns as if the very ocean recognizes and fears what has awakened from its slumber. The Kraken, according to Norwegian folklore, is a creature of such immense proportions that sailors often mistake it for an island or a shoal. Bishop Erik Pontoppidan, writing in his Natural History of Norway in 1753, described it as being over 1.5 miles in circumference. But numbers, dear viewers, cannot truly capture the terror inspired by this legendary beast. Imagine tentacles longer than the tallest cathedral spires covered in suckers the size of wagon wheels. Picture eyes larger than the great rose windows of Notre Dame, glowing with an intelligence both alien and malevolent. The Kraken's body, if the legends are to be believed, could house entire cities within its bulk. a living fortress of flesh and fury that calls the deepest trenches of the ocean home. Captain Ericsson's crew stands frozen at the rails as the creature's tentacles begin to move with deliberate, terrifying purpose. The sea around them starts to churn as the Kraken prepares to surface fully, and Ericsson realizes with growing dread that his ship, his proud Storm's End, is positioned directly above the beast's massive head. He bellows, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining authority in the face of the impossible. Hard to starboard, every man to the oars. But it is too late. The Kraken has noticed them. One massive tentacle, glistening with brine and covered in what appears to be centuries of accumulated sea growth, rises from the water like a serpentine tower. It moves with surprising grace for something so enormous, and Ericsson watches in fascination and terror as it approaches his ship with almost curious deliberation. The legends speak of the Kraken's intelligence, how it would sometimes surface beneath ships not out of malice, but from a kind of otherworldly curiosity about these strange floating objects that dared to traverse its domain. Some tales suggest that the creature could choose to be merciful, allowing ships to pass if it sensed no threat or ill intent from their crews. But other stories speak of ships dragged beneath the waves in the space of a heartbeat, their crews consumed by a creature so vast that it could swallow them without even noticing. These tales describe whirlpools created by the Kraken's movement that could pull down entire fleets, and tentacles strong enough to crush the hulls of even the mightiest warships like paper. As the tentacle draws closer to the Storm's End, Captain Ericsson finds himself face to face with one of the creature's massive suckers. Each one is lined with what appear to be teeth, not the sharp predatory fangs of a shark, but something far more disturbing. These teeth seem almost human-like in their arrangement, as if the Kraken has somehow absorbed the essence of all those it has consumed over the millennia. The crew holds its collective breath as the tentacle hovers mere feet from their vessel. Then, in a moment that Captain Ericsson will replay in his nightmares for the rest of his days, one of the creature's enormous eyes breaks the surface. It is an eye that has witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, that has watched as continents shifted and ice ages came and went. In its alien depths, Ericsson sees not malice, but something far more unsettling: indifference. To the Kraken, humans are less than insects, their ships mere curiosities floating on the surface of its vast domain. The creature regards them for what feels like an eternity, but is likely only seconds. Then, with a movement that sends massive waves cascading across the ocean's surface, the Kraken descends back into the depths, leaving only a series of whirlpools to mark its passage. Captain Ericsson and his crew survive their encounter, but they are forever changed. The captain's log, discovered years later in the archives of Bergen's Maritime Museum, contains this entry: "We have seen that which no mortal man should witness, and live to tell the tale. The sea holds secrets that would drive lesser men to madness. I pray that we never again cross paths with the great beast of the depths, for I fear our luck may not hold a second time." But the Kraken's influence extends far beyond individual encounter. In Scandinavian culture, the creature became a symbol of the ocean's ultimate power, a reminder that no matter how skilled or brave, humanity remains at the mercy of forces beyond our comprehension or control. The fishing villages of Norway's coast are filled with tales of the Kraken's feeding habits. They say that when the creature rises to feed, it releases a substance into the water that attracts vast schools of fish. Fishermen who were brave or foolish enough to cast their nets in these waters would sometimes return with catches so abundant that their boats nearly sank under the weight. But they learned to recognize the signs: water that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence, schools of fish so dense they turned the sea black, and most telling of all, a profound stillness that seemed to settle over the ocean like a blanket. When these signs appeared, the wise fishermen would flee, knowing that the Kraken was below, and that their small boats were in mortal danger. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Kraken legend is not its size or strength, but its intelligence. Unlike the mindless monsters of many myths, the Kraken is described as a thinking, planning creature. Some accounts suggest it could learn the patterns of shipping routes, positioning itself to intercept vessels at the most vulnerable points of their journey. There are tales of the creature following ships for days, always remaining just beneath the surface, biding its time until the perfect moment to strike. Sailors spoke of seeing massive shadows keeping pace with their vessels, shadows that were always just a little too large, a little too purposeful to be tricks of light or imagination. The most terrifying stories, however, are those that suggest the Kraken could mimic. Survivors of encounters describe hearing voices calling from the water, voices of loved ones, of crew members who had been lost overboard days before, even voices of people they had never met but who seemed to know intimate details of their lives. These spectral calls would emanate from areas where the tentacles moved just beneath the surface, as if the creature had somehow absorbed not just the bodies of its victims, but their memories, their souls, their very essence. Sailors who listened too closely to these phantom voices often threw themselves overboard, drawn by an irresistible compulsion to join those who called from the depths. The influence of the Kraken extends far beyond Scandinavian folklore. As trade routes expanded and sailors from different cultures shared their tales, the legend spread across the globe. Each culture added its own interpretations, its own fears and superstitions to the growing myth. In Scottish waters the creature was known as the Hafstrang, while Portuguese sailors called it the polvo colossal. Japanese fishermen spoke of the Akara Kamui, a massive octopus-like being that could heal as quickly as it could destroy. Yet regardless of the name or cultural interpretation, the core elements remained the same: an impossibly large sea creature with tentacles, intelligence, and the power to destroy ships with ease. The scientific community has long debated the origins of the Kraken legend. Some point to encounters with giant squids, creatures that can indeed grow to enormous sizes and possess the tentacles described in the myth. Others suggest that the legend arose from observations of large whales or groups of whales feeding together, their movements creating the illusion of a single massive creature. But those who have studied the most detailed accounts note inconsistencies that cannot be easily explained by known marine life. The Kraken's described behavior, its apparent intelligence, its ability to create whirlpools of sufficient size to threaten large ships, its reported longevity suggests something beyond our current understanding of marine biology. As we prepare to leave the cold waters where the Kraken dwells, let us remember Captain Ericsson's words: "Some things are better left undisturbed in the depths." The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, yet we have explored less than 5% of its depth. In those unmapped abyssal plains and deep-sea trenches, who can say what ancient creatures might still lurk, waiting for the right moment to remind humanity that we are merely visitors in their vast, dark domain. The Kraken represents more than just a monster. It embodies our deepest fears about the unknown, our anxiety about venturing into spaces where we do not belong. It is a reminder that for all our technological advancement, for all our maps and instruments, and proud ships, the sea remains essentially alien to us, a realm where our rules do not apply and our presence is suffered only at the whim of forces far greater than ourselves. Now let us turn our attention from the frigid northern seas to warmer but no less dangerous waters, where an even more ancient terror awaits. In the beginning, before the first human footprint marked a shoreline, before the first sail caught wind, there was chaos. And from the primordial waters of chaos rose a creature so powerful, so fundamentally opposed to the order of creation, that its very name became synonymous with overwhelming, unstoppable force. This creature is Leviathan, the biblical beast that has haunted humanity's collective consciousness for over 3 millennia. Let us journey back not merely through time, but through the very foundations of human storytelling, to an age when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were as fluid as the seas themselves. Picture, if you will, the ancient port city of Tyre, its bustling harbors filled with the ships of Phoenician merchants who dared to venture beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the vast Atlantic unknown. It is here that we meet Hiram ben Ashtareh, master navigator and keeper of the old story. His weathered face, marked by decades of salt spray and harsh sun, bears the wisdom of one who has sailed every known sea and glimpsed mysteries that lesser men would dismiss as impossible. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, hold depths that rival the ocean itself. On this particular evening, as purple twilight settles over the Mediterranean, Hiram sits in the harbor tavern known as the Fisherman's Rest, surrounded by younger sailors eager to hear his tales. The air is thick with the scent of oil lamps and roasted fish, and outside the gentle lapping of waves against stone provides a rhythmic backdrop to his words. "You speak of the Kraken," Hiram says, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, "but that creature, fearsome though it may be, is merely a beast of flesh and blood. Tonight I shall tell you of something far more terrible. A creature that existed before time itself had meaning, before the stars found their places in the heavens. He pauses to take a long drink from his cup, and in that silence, even the tavern's usual clamor seems to die away. The younger sailors lean forward, drawn by something in the old navigator's manner that speaks of truths too profound for casual telling. I speak of Leviathan, Hiram continues, and at the mention of that name, several of the listeners make protective signs with their hands. The great dragon of the depths, the serpent of the sea, whose awakening heralds the end of all things. The biblical Leviathan first appears in the book of Job, where God himself describes the creature in terms that make clear its supernatural nature. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? The implication is clear. This is no ordinary sea creature, but something beyond human power to capture or control. But Hiram's knowledge extends far beyond the biblical account. In his years of travel, he has collected fragments of even older stories, tales that trace Leviathan's origins back to the very dawn of creation. According to these ancient traditions, when the world was young and the divine forces first shaped reality from the primordial chaos, Leviathan was created as the ultimate embodiment of the sea's power. In the beginning, Hiram tells his rapt audience, the world was water, not the gentle seas we know, but a vast, roiling chaos where order had no meaning. From this chaos, the Creator drew forth the land and separated the waters above from the waters below. But something of that original chaos remained, and it took the form of Leviathan. According to Hebrew tradition, Leviathan was originally created as a pair, male and female, but the Creator, foreseeing the devastation that their offspring might wreak upon the world, destroyed the female and reserved her flesh for the righteous to feast upon in the world to come. The male was left to dwell alone in the deepest parts of the ocean, a living reminder of the primordial chaos that existed before creation brought order to the universe. But this theological interpretation only begins to capture the terror inspired by Leviathan. Unlike the Kraken, which is described primarily in terms of its physical characteristics, Leviathan represents something far more fundamental, the force of chaos itself made manifest in the material world. Hiram's eyes grow distant as he recalls his own encounter with the creature. It was in the waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules, he says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We had been at sea for 40 days, following trade winds into uncharted waters. The crew was growing restless, and I began to question the wisdom of venturing so far from known shores. On the 41st morning, the sea changed. The water, which had been the familiar blue-green of deep ocean, turned black as night. Not the black of storm clouds or deep shadows, but a black that seemed to absorb light itself. The waves stilled until the surface became like polished obsidian, and in that unnatural calm we saw our first sign of what lay beneath. The ship Hiram commanded was the Desert Star, a sturdy vessel built from the famous cedars of Lebanon. Her crew consisted of 27 men, each chosen for his skill and courage. They had weathered storms that would have sunk lesser ships, and navigated by stars that existed only in the most ancient chart. But as they floated upon that impossible Black Sea, even these hardened sailors felt the touch of primordial terror. The water around them began to glow with a phosphorescent light that seemed to come from incredible depth. This was not the familiar bioluminescence they had encountered near coastal waters, but something far more unsettling, a light that pulsed with a rhythm like a massive heart. Then we heard the song, Hiram continues, his voice taking on a quality that makes his listeners strain to catch every word. It came from below, from depths so profound that the sound reached us not through our ears but seemed to resonate in our very bones. It was beautiful and terrible at once, like the music of creation itself, but played in a minor key that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. The biblical descriptions of Leviathan emphasize the creature's invulnerability. His scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a sea. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another, they clasp each other and cannot be separated. This is not merely a description of armor, but of perfection, a creature so perfectly designed for its environment that it becomes a force of nature rather than simply a living being. As the desert star floated upon that eerily calm sea, the crew began to see shapes moving in the depths below. At first they appeared to be vast schools of fish, but as the shapes drew closer to the surface, their true nature became horrifyingly clear. These were not separate creatures, but parts of something so immense that the human mind struggled to comprehend its totality. A fin the size of a ship's sail broke the surface 100 yards away, followed by another and another. But these were not the fins of multiple creatures. They were the dorsal projections of a single being so enormous that its various body parts appeared to be separate entities moving in coordination. The scales, Hiram whispers, his hands trembling slightly as he recalls the size. Each one was the size of a warrior's shield, and they gleamed like polished bronze in that strange phosphorescent light. But it was not their size that filled us with terror. It was their perfection. They overlapped with such precision that not even a blade could have found purchase between them. The biblical account speaks of Leviathan's eyes like the eyelids of the dawn, and Hiram confirms this description with the authority of one who has gazed into those cosmic orbs. When its eyes opened, he says, they lit the water for miles around, not with the warm light of sunrise, but with something far more ancient, the light that existed before the sun was created, the illumination of pure divinity made manifest in physical form. But it was Leviathan's breath that proved most terrifying. According to the book of Job, out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils smoke goes forth as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame goes forth from his mouth. Hiram's crew watched in awe and terror as great gouts of steam rose from the water around them, not from any visible opening, but as if the sea itself were boiling from the creature's presence. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, filled with a sulphurous scent that spoke of depths where the earth's fire meets the primordial waters. And then, Hiram says, his voice growing stronger as he approaches the climax of his tale, the voice of Leviathan, according to Hiram's account, was not heard but felt, a vibration that passed through water and wood and flesh to resonate in the deepest parts of the soul. It did not speak in words, for words are tools of creation and order, and Leviathan is the embodiment of the chaos that existed before language gave shape to thought. Instead, the creature communicated through pure emotion and concept. In that brief contact, Hiram and his crew experienced something that human consciousness was never designed to process, the perspective of a being that remembered the time before time, that had witnessed the formation of the world, and would survive to see its ending. They saw the universe as Leviathan saw it, not as a collection of separate objects and events, but as a single flowing entity in constant flux. They experienced the creature's loneliness, the isolation of being the last remnant of the primordial chaos, forever separated from the ordered world that had replaced its realm. But most terrifying of all, they glimpsed Leviathan's purpose. For the biblical tradition speaks not only of the creature's current existence, but of its future role. In the end times, when the world returns to the chaos from which it emerged, Leviathan will rise from the depths to reclaim dominion over the waters and drag all of creation back into the primordial darkness. The encounter lasted only moments in real time, but for Hiram and his crew it felt like hours. When Leviathan finally withdrew its attention and sank back into the depths, the sea returned to its normal blue-green hue, and gentle waves began to lap against the hull of the desert star once more. But the crew was forever changed. 3 men went mad from what they had experienced, and threw themselves overboard before anyone could stop them. Others survived but never spoke of the sea again, choosing instead to spend their remaining days far from any body of water. Even Hiram, strongest of them all, found that his dreams were haunted by visions of the end times, when Leviathan would rise again to fulfill its cosmic purpose. The influence of Leviathan extends far beyond individual encounters or even biblical tradition. In Jewish mysticism, the creature represents the force of divine judgment in its most absolute form. The Talmud speaks of the righteous feasting on Leviathan's flesh in the world to come, a metaphor for the ultimate triumph of order over chaos, of divine justice over primordial anarchy. But other traditions are less optimistic about humanity's ultimate relationship with the great beast. In some versions of the legend, Leviathan is not merely waiting for the end times, it is actively working to bring them about. Every storm, every tsunami, Every unexplained disaster at sea is attributed to the creature's influence as it slowly weakens the barriers that keep chaos at bay. Medieval cartographers often placed images of Leviathan at the edges of their maps, in the unexplored regions where here-be dragons warned travelers of the dangers that awaited beyond the boundaries of the known world. These were not merely decorative elements, but acknowledgments of a fundamental truth, that human knowledge and control extend only so far, and beyond their limits lie forces that predate and will ultimately outlast all human civilization. The scientific age has attempted to rationalize Leviathan, suggesting that the legend arose from encounters with large whales or other marine life. But such explanations miss the essential point of the myth. Leviathan is not meant to be understood as a biological entity, but as a cosmic principle, the acknowledgement that beneath the apparent order of the natural world lies something far older and more powerful. As Hiram concludes his tale in that ancient tavern, the younger sailors sit in contemplative silence. They have heard not merely a story, but a fundamental truth about the nature of existence itself. The sea that they have chosen as their profession and their passion is not merely a highway for trade or a source of fish, but the domain of forces that dwarf human understanding. Remember this, Hiram tells them as he rises to leave, when you sail into unknown waters or when storms test your courage, you are not merely contending with wind and wave, but with the remnants of the chaos that existed before the world began. Show proper respect, and you may be allowed to pass. Approach with arrogance, and you risk awakening something that even the Creator himself chose to keep sleeping in the depths. The legend of Leviathan serves as more than just a cautionary tale about the dangers of the sea. It represents humanity's acknowledgement that there are aspects of existence that lie beyond our comprehension or control. In our modern age of satellite navigation and weather prediction, of submersibles and sonar mapping, it might be tempting to dismiss such tales as primitive superstition, but the deepest parts of the ocean remain as mysterious today as they were to Hiram ben Ashtaray 3,000 years ago. We have mapped the surface of Mars more thoroughly than we have charted our own ocean floor. In those unmapped abyssal depths, in trenches so deep that the pressure would crush any human-made vessel, who can say with certainty what ancient creatures might yet dwell? Leviathan reminds us that the natural world was not created for our convenience or comprehension. It existed long before humans appeared and will continue long after we are gone. Our relationship with the sea, like our relationship with existence itself, must be founded on humility and respect, rather than the arrogant assumption that we can master forces far greater than ourselves. Now let us leave the theological depths, where Leviathan dwells, and travel to the wine-dark waters of the ancient Mediterranean, where Greek sailors faced terrors that were no less real for being born of myth, rather than scripture. Between the toe of Italy and the shores of Sicily lies a stretch of water that has inspired terror in the hearts of sailors for over 3,000 years. The Strait of Messina, barely 2 miles wide at its narrowest point, seems innocent enough to modern eyes. A simple passage between two landmasses, crossed daily by ferries and fishing boats, with casual indifference to the legends that once made these waters synonymous with certain doom. But let us journey back to an age when myth and reality danced together like lovers in the Mediterranean moonlight, when the line between the natural and supernatural was as fluid as the tide itself. Cast your minds to the year 1184 BCE, in the aftermath of the Great Siege of Troy, when heroes and survivors alike sought new lands and new destinies across the wine-dark sea. It is here that we encounter Captain Alexios of Ithaca, cousin to the legendary Odysseus and commander of the swift-sailing galley Thalassa's Pride. Unlike his famous relative, Alexios chose to return home immediately after Troy's fall, leading a convoy of free ships, loaded with Trojan treasure and 60 of Ithaca's finest warriors. He was a practical man, Alexios, more concerned with getting his men home safely than with grand adventures or divine encounters. But the gods, as they often do, had other plans. On the 37th day of their voyage, after weathering storms that had scattered their small fleet across half the Mediterranean, Alexios found himself approaching the dreaded Strait of Messina with only his flagship remaining. His other 2 vessels had been lost in a tempest off the coast of Crete, their crews swallowed by waves as tall as temple columns. Standing at the prow of the Thalassa's Pride, his bronze armor dulled by salt spray and his dark hair whipped by sea winds, Alexios studied the waters ahead with growing unease. Local fishermen in the last port had warned him about this passage, their faces growing pale as they spoke, in hushed tones of the twin terrors that guarded the strait. On one side dwells Scylla, old Nestor the fisherman had whispered, his gnarled hands shaking as he poured wine to ward off evil. Once she was a beautiful nymph, beloved of the sea god Glaucus. But Circe's jealousy transformed her into something else. 6 heads she has now, each with triple rows of teeth, and from her cave in the cliffs she feeds on any who venture too close to shore. And on the other side, Alexios had asked, though he dreaded the answer. Charybdis, came the reply. Spoken so quietly it was barely audible above the tavern's noise. 3 times each day she drinks the sea, and 3 times she spews it forth. The whirlpool she creates can drag down the mightiest ship, pulling it into depths from which no man returns. Now, as Alexios gazed across the narrowing waters of the strait, these warnings echoed in his mind. To his left rose the towering cliffs of what would later be called Calabria, their rocky faces scarred by centuries of wind and wave. To his right lay Sicily's northeastern shore, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. But between these two land masses, the sea behaved in ways that defied all natural explanation. Currents moved in impossible directions, creating eddies and whirlpools that appeared and disappeared without warning. The water itself seemed to change color randomly, now the deep blue of open ocean, now an ominous black that spoke of profound depths, now a sickly green that made the strongest stomach turn. Captain, called Demetrios, his first mate and oldest friend, the men are asking which side we should favor. The passage is narrow and we must choose our course soon. Alexios studied both shores with the eye of an experienced sailor. Logic suggested hugging the Sicilian coast, where the waters appeared calmer and the approach more gradual. But something in his warrior's instincts rebelled against that choice. The very tranquility of those waters felt wrong, like the deceptive calm that precedes an ambush. As if in response to his thoughts, the sea near the Sicilian shore began to move in a way that made his blood run cold. What had appeared to be gentle swells suddenly organized themselves into a circular pattern, the water beginning to rotate slowly around an invisible center. As he watched, the rotation increased in speed, and the gentle depression at its heart deepened into something far more sinister. Charybdis, he whispered, and the name seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken curse. The ancient poets described Charybdis as a daughter of Poseidon and Gaia, transformed into a monstrous whirlpool as punishment for her excessive greed. But the reality that Alexios witnessed defied even mythological explanation. This was no simple whirlpool created by tidal forces or underwater topography. This was something that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence all its own. The circular motion of the water continued to accelerate until it became a roaring vortex easily 100 yards across. The sound it produced was unlike anything in nature. Not the simple rush of moving water, but something that seemed almost vocal, as if the whirlpool itself were calling out in a voice too deep for human ears to properly interpret. Around the edges of this aquatic maelstrom, debris appeared and disappeared with horrifying regularity. Pieces of ships that had been destroyed weeks or even months before were suddenly disgorged from the depths, spinning madly around the whirlpool's perimeter before being sucked back down into the abyss. Alexios spotted the painted stern of what had once been a Phoenician trader, the carved figurehead of an Egyptian galley, and most chillingly the bloated corpses of sailors whose ships had met their doom in this accursed place. Hard to port, Alexios commanded, his voice cutting through the sound of wind and wave. We'll take our chances with the other side. But as the Thalassa's pride altered course toward the Calabrian cliffs, Alexios realized that he had merely chosen the nature of his doom rather than avoiding it entirely. For from the rocky heights above came a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a howling that seemed to combine the fury of winter storms with the hunger of starving wolves. The creature known as Scylla made her lair in a cave high up on the cliff face, but her reach extended far beyond her rocky home. Ancient sources described her as having 6 heads on long serpentine necks, each capable of snatching a man from the deck of a passing ship. But Homer's account, for all its poetic power, failed to capture the true horror of encountering this transformed nymph in her moment of ravenous fury. As Alexios watched in fascination and terror, the cave mouth high above began to change. What had appeared to be merely a dark opening in the rock face revealed itself to be something far more sinister. 6 enormous serpentine necks, each thicker than the main mast of his ship, began to emerge from the depths of the cavern. The heads that crowned these necks defied description. They retained enough of Scylla's original beauty to be recognizable as having once been human. But that beauty had been twisted into something nightmarish. Her faces were pale as bone, with eyes that glowed with an inner fire born of endless hunger and rage. Her hair, once golden as summer wheat, now writhed like living shadows around features that might have launched 1,000 ships had they not been corrupted by divine wrath. But it was the mouths that inspired the greatest terror. Each head possessed not one set of jaws, but 3. An outer mouth lined with teeth, like broken glass, an inner mouth that gaped like a tunnel leading to the underworld, and a throat that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to hypnotize prey into willing submission. "Shields up," Alexios commanded, but he knew that bronze armor and linden wood would provide little protection against a creature of such supernatural power. The 6 heads swayed above them like cobras preparing to strike, and in their glowing eyes he could see an intelligence both human and utterly alien. Scylla's transformation, according to legend, had been the result of a love triangle between herself, the sea god Glaucus, and the sorceress Circe. When Glaucus chose Scylla over the divine enchantress, Circe's jealousy had prompted her to poison the waters where the beautiful nymph bathed. But instead of simply killing her rival, the sorceress had chosen a far crueler fate, transforming Scylla into a creature that would know only hunger and rage for all eternity. The tragedy of Scylla lay not just in her monstrous form, but in the fact that somewhere within that twisted flesh, the original nymph remained conscious and aware. She could remember her former beauty, her innocent love for Glaucus, the simple joy of dancing with her sister nymphs in underwater grottos lit by phosphorescent coral. But those memories only served to intensify her fury at what she had become. As the first of Scylla's heads struck down toward the Thalassa's pride, Alexios found himself staring into eyes that held the accumulated pain and rage of centuries. This was not a mindless beast acting on instinct, but a thinking, feeling being driven to madness by the cruelty of her fate. The massive head struck the water beside the ship with enough force to send a geyser shooting skyward, soaking the crew and causing the vessel to rock violently from side to side. But instead of trying immediately for another strike, Scylla paused, her 6 heads weaving hypnotically above the galley as she studied her potential prey with predatory intelligence. "She's toying with us," whispered Demetrios, his knuckles white as he gripped his spear. Like a cat with a mouth. Indeed, Scylla's hunting patterns had become legendary throughout the Mediterranean. Unlike a simple predator that would strike immediately to satisfy its hunger, she had developed a taste for psychological torment that spoke to the human intelligence trapped within her monstrous form. She would often allow ships to pass partially through her domain before attacking, letting crews believe they had escaped before snatching them at the moment of their greatest hope. Other times, she would take only 1 or 2 sailors, leaving the rest to sail on with the knowledge that their companion's sacrifice had purchased their temporary safety. The guilt and trauma inflicted by such encounters often drove surviving sailors to madness, achieving a psychological victory that satisfied Scylla's transformed psyche more than simple consumption ever could. But today, something was different. As Alexios met the creature's burning gaze, he saw something that surprised him, a flicker of recognition. Perhaps even a ghost of the empathy she had possessed in her former existence. For Alexios bore the marks of his own transformation through war and loss. The fall of Troy, the death of friends, the weight of command in impossible circumstances, all of these had changed him from the young prince who had sailed east 10 years before. In that moment of mutual recognition between 2 beings forever altered by circumstances beyond their control, an understanding passed between them. Scylla's heads withdrew slightly, and for a heartbeat, Alexios dared to hope that she might allow them to pass unharmed. But then the wind shifted, carrying to Scylla's supernatural senses the scent of the Trojan treasure loaded in the Thalassa's pride's hold. Among those golden artifacts were items that had once belonged to Helen of Troy, perfumes and jewelry still carrying the essence of the beauty whose face had indeed launched 1,000 ships and caused the deaths of heroes on both sides of the Great War. The reminder of Helen's beauty, and by extension of her own lost loveliness, drove Scylla into a rage that shook the very foundations of the cliffs. Her howl of fury echoed across the strait, causing rocks to break free from the cliff face and crash into the sea below. All 6 heads struck simultaneously, and Alexios realized that his moment of hope had been merely the calm before an unprecedented storm. What followed was less a battle than a desperate dance of survival. The Thalassa's pride, despite being one of the swiftest vessels in the Greek fleet, found herself barely able to maneuver between the striking heads while avoiding the treacherous rocks that lined the shore. Each time Alexios thought he had found a safe course, another serpentine neck would block their path, forcing them back toward the center of the strait, where Charybdis waited with patient malevolence. The crew fought with the desperation of men who knew that death was the least terrible fate that awaited them. Those who had served in the siege of Troy had faced human enemies, but this was something entirely different, a creature that combined supernatural power with intimate knowledge of human psychology, and an immortal grudge against all beautiful things. 3 of his men were taken in the first series of strikes, not killed outright, but plucked from the deck and lifted high into the air where Scylla's multiple mouths could savor their terror before consumption. The remaining crew members could hear their screams echoing from the heights long after the men themselves had disappeared into the creature's maws. But it was not just the physical threat that tested them. Scylla's voices for each head could speak independently, filled the air with taunts and promises that struck at the deepest fears and desires of every man aboard. She spoke to Alexios of his wife waiting in Ithaca, describing in intimate detail how she would react to news of his death, how she would mourn, and eventually how she would forget and find comfort in another's arms. To his men she offered bargains, their lives in exchange for their captains, their freedom in return for renouncing their loyalty to home and family. These psychological attacks proved almost as devastating as her physical assaults, causing hesitation and doubt at moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, the whirlpool of Charybdis continued its relentless rotation, drawing ever closer as the current pulled them inexorably toward the Sicilian shore. The monster's 3 times daily cycle was approaching its peak, and soon the entire strait would become a maelstrom from which no ship could escape. It was Demetrios who provided the key to their salvation, though it came at a cost that would haunt Alexios for the rest of his days. Remembering stories of Scylla's former nature, the first mate began to sing, not a battle hymn or a prayer to the gods, but a simple love song that had been popular among the nymphs and shepherds of their homeland. The effect was immediate and heartbreaking. All 6 of Scylla's heads ceased their attacks and turned toward the source of the music. For a moment the creature's monstrous features softened, and in her burning eyes appeared a look of such profound longing and grief that even the hardened warriors on deck felt tears spring to their eyes. In that song Scylla heard echoes of her former life, memories of dancing with her sisters in moonlit groves, of love songs shared with Glaucus before jealousy and transformation had destroyed their happiness. For just an instant the human soul trapped within the monster's form remembered what it meant to be capable of joy rather than only rage and hunger. But the reprieve was brief. As the song ended, reality crashed back upon Scylla with renewed fury. She had been reminded of everything she had lost, everything that could never be recovered, and her rage at this fresh cruelty exceeded even her previous wrath. All 6 heads reared back for what would clearly be a final devastating assault, one that would crush the Thalassa's pride and all aboard her into splinters and foam. At that moment, Alexios made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of trying to flee or fight, he stood up in full view of the creature and spoke directly to the woman he knew still existed within the monster. "Scylla," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the water, "you were not always a creature of rage and hunger. Once you knew love. Once you understood mercy.
I do not ask you to spare us out of kindness, for I know that Circe's curse has driven such feelings from your heart. But I ask you to remember that we, like you, are victims of circumstances beyond our control. The war that made us who we are was not of our choosing, just as your transformation was not of yours. The 6 heads froze in mid-strike, and for a long moment, the only sound was the distant roar of Charybdis drawing ever nearer. Then, in a voice that somehow combined all 6 mouths into a harmony both beautiful and terrible, Scylla spoke. You speak of choice, mortal, but what choice do I have? My hunger is eternal, my rage unquenchable. Even if I wish to show mercy, my nature compels me to feed. This is what I have become, what I will always be until the end of time itself.
Then let us pass, Alexios replied, not because you choose mercy, but because we choose to trust in whatever humanity remains within you. We could have tried to fight you or trick you, but instead we offer ourselves to your judgment. Do with us what your conscience, not your curse, demands. What followed was a silence so profound that it seemed to encompass not just the strait, but the entire Mediterranean. Even Charybdis seemed to pause in her endless rotation, as if the entire cosmos waited to see how this confrontation between monster and mortal would resolve. Then, with a movement so subtle that it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light, Scylla's heads withdrew toward her cave. She did not speak again, did not offer explanation or farewell. She simply withdrew, leaving the passage clear for the Thalassa's pride to continue on her way. But as Alexios ordered full sail to carry them away from both Scylla's cliffs and Charybdis's whirlpool, he heard something that would echo in his dreams for the rest of his life. The sound of 6 voices raised in a lament so profound that it seemed to encompass all the tragedy and loss that had marked the Age of Heroes. The Thalassa's pride survived her passage through the Strait of Messina, but the encounter changed everyone aboard. Alexios reached Ithaca 3 days later with his ship and most of his crew intact, but the treasure in his hold seemed somehow tainted by the memory of Scylla's grief. He distributed it among his men and the families of those who had been lost, keeping nothing for himself. In the years that followed, other ships would brave the strait and encounter its guardian monsters. Some would survive through courage, others through cunning, and a few through simple luck. But all who passed between Scylla and Charybdis carried away with them the knowledge that the most dangerous monsters are often those who were once something else. Creatures whose evil stems not from inherent malice, but from wounds that have festered into rage. The twin terrors of the strait became symbols in Greek culture of the impossible choices that life sometimes presents. To be between Scylla and Charybdis meant to face a situation where every option led to destruction, where survival depended not on finding a perfect solution, but on choosing which form of catastrophe one could best endure. But perhaps more importantly, the legend served as a reminder that monsters are not born but made, created by circumstances, choices and cruel twists of fate that can transform beauty into horror, love into hatred, and innocence into ravenous hunger. In Scylla's tragic figure, the Greeks saw reflected their own capacity for transformation, their own vulnerability to forces beyond their control. Modern attempts to rationalize the legend point to the genuine navigational hazards of the Strait of Messina. The narrow passage creates unusual currents and whirlpools, and the rocky shores have indeed claimed countless ships over the millennia. But such explanations miss the deeper truth embedded in the myth that some passages in life cannot be navigated by skill or technology alone, but require a confrontation with forces that challenge our fundamental understanding of right and wrong, mercy and justice, monster and human. As we leave the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean and the tragic figure of Scylla weeping eternally in her cave, let us carry with us the lesson that Alexios learned in that moment of crisis. Sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting monsters, but in recognizing the humanity that may still exist within them. For in a world where gods can transform nymphs into beasts and war can turn heroes into killers, the line between monster and mortal is far thinner than we might wish to believe. Now let us journey north, to the icy waters of Scandinavia, where a different kind of terror awaits, one that encompasses not just destruction, but the end of all things. In the frozen wastes of the North Sea, where winter storms rage for months without cease, and the aurora borealis paints the sky in colors that have no earthly names, there exists a terror so vast that it literally encircles the world itself. This is Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, whose very existence is both a promise and a threat, for while his presence keeps the oceans of the world from spilling into the cosmic void, his awakening will herald the end of all things. Let us journey to the year 9073 CE, to the windswept shores of Norway, where we encounter Bjorn Eriksson, not to be confused with the whaling captain of our earlier tale, but a skald and keeper of the old stories whose memory held within it the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations. Unlike the Christian monks who were beginning to write down the tales of the North in their stone monasteries, Bjorn carried his knowledge in the ancient way, woven into poems and songs that could survive the passage of ages without the need for parchment or ink. On this particular evening, as snow swirls around his longhouse and the northern lights dance across the star-studded sky, Bjorn sits before his hearth, surrounded by the warriors of Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe. These are hard men, veterans of raids from Ireland to Constantinople, yet they lean forward like children as the old skald begins to weave his tale. "You have heard," Bjorn says, his voice carrying the rhythm of ancient verse, "of the serpent that lies coiled beneath the waves, wrapped around Midgard like a belt around a warrior's waist. But tonight, I shall tell you how that serpent came to be, and what his awakening will mean for gods and men alike." The tale of Jormungandr begins with Loki, the shape-shifting trickster god whose cleverness was matched only by his capacity for causing chaos. In his wanderings through the 9 realms, Loki had encountered the giantess Angrboda, whose name means she who brings grief. Their union produced 3 children, each more terrifying than the last. Fenrir the wolf, whose strength would eventually prove capable of devouring Odin himself. Hel, who became goddess of the dishonored dead, and Jormungandr the world serpent. When the Aesir discovered the existence of these monstrous offspring, they were faced with a dilemma that would echo through the ages. Prophecy foretold that Loki's children would play crucial roles in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods and the end of the current world order. Yet the gods also knew that attempting to destroy the children might only hasten the very doom they sought to prevent. Their solution was both pragmatic and cruel. Fenrir was bound with chains forged from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the breath of a fish, the roots of a mountain. Hel was banished to rule over the realm of the dishonored dead, and Jormungandr was cast into the great ocean that surrounds Midgard, where he was left to grow in the cold depths far from the halls of Asgard. But the gods had underestimated the serpent's potential for growth. Fed by the endless abundance of the sea and sustained by his own supernatural nature, Jormungandr grew beyond all reasonable proportion. He consumed whales as other serpents might devour mice, and schools of fish disappeared into his maw without even registering on his consciousness. As centuries passed, the serpent continued to grow until he achieved the impossible. His body became so immense that he could wrap himself completely around the world, grasping his own tail in his mouth. At this point, Jormungandr achieved a kind of cosmic significance that transcended his nature as merely another monster. He became a fundamental part of the world's structure, the living boundary between the ordered realm of Midgard and the chaotic void beyond. Bjorn's audience listens in rapt silence as he describes the serpent's current state, sleeping in the deepest trenches of the ocean floor, his breathing creating the tides that mark the passage of time for all who dwell upon the earth's surface. When Jormungandr inhales, the seas retreat from the shores. When he exhales, the waves return with renewed force. But do not mistake his slumber for peaceful rest. Bjorn warns, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Even in sleep the world serpent dreams, and his dreams shape the very nature of the oceans themselves. When he dreams of battle, storms rage across the seas, and ships founder in waves tall as mountains. When he dreams of hunger, sea creatures flee to the deepest parts of the ocean, leaving fishermen with empty nets and growling bellies. The skald's words are not mere poetry, but reflect the genuine beliefs of the Norse seafaring culture. Sailors from Bergen to Greenland swore that they could feel the serpent's presence beneath them whenever they ventured far from shore.
The great currents that circle the globe were attributed to Jormungandr's movements in his sleep, and the deep ocean trenches were thought to be places where his coils had pressed deepest into the sea floor. But it was not just the serpent's physical presence that concerned those who followed the old ways. According to prophecy, Jormungandr's role in the final battle of Ragnarok would be both pivotal and devastating. When the end times arrive and the forces of chaos marshal for their final assault on the gods, the world serpent will release his tail and rise from the depths in a fury that will poison both sea and sky. Picture this, if you can. Bjorn continues, his voice taking on the cadence of prophecy itself. The serpent rising from waters that have become black as a moonless night, his head towering above the highest mountains, his eyes burning like twin suns in the darkness. With each breath he will spew venom that will rain down upon the earth, killing every living thing it touches. The very air will become poison, and the seas will boil with his rage. According to the Voluspa, the most important of the prophetic poems, Jormungandr's emergence will be one of the key signs that Ragnarok has begun. The serpent will thrash in the ocean with such violence that tsunamis will sweep across every coastline, drowning entire kingdoms beneath walls of water that reach to the clouds. But the world serpent's greatest opponent in the final battle will be Thor, god of thunder and protector of Midgard. The enmity between them is ancient and personal, dating back to Thor's first encounter with the serpent in the halls of the giant Utgard Loki, when the thunder god attempted to lift what he thought was a cat, but was actually Jormungandr in disguise. Bjorn's voice drops to barely above a whisper as he recounts the prophecy of their final confrontation. Thor will face the serpent with Mjolnir in his hand, and the strength of the gods in his arm. The battle will shake the very foundations of the world, causing mountains to crumble and the earth itself to crack open. In the end, Thor will strike the killing blow, driving his hammer deep into the serpent's skull and ending the monster's threat forever. The warriors around the fire grunt their approval at this description of their patron god's ultimate victory, but Bjorn raises a hand for silence. But hear this. And despair, for though Thor will slay the world serpent, the victory will come at a terrible price. The poison that Jormungandr breathes will enter the thunder god's lungs, and though he will have strength enough to walk 9 steps from the battlefield, on the 10th step he will fall dead, victim of the serpent's final revenge. This mutual destruction of hero and monster represents one of the most profound themes in Norse mythology, the idea that even victory comes at a cost that may make it indistinguishable from defeat. Thor's death immediately after slaying Jormungandr symbolizes the pyrrhic nature of the god's struggle against the forces of chaos, suggesting that order can be maintained only through constant sacrifice. But Jormungandr's significance extends beyond his role in the end time. In Norse cosmology, the serpent represents the principle of boundaries, the idea that existence itself requires limits, borders between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown. By wrapping himself around the world and grasping his own tail, the world serpent creates the Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of eternal cycles and the unity of opposites. This aspect of the myth reflects a sophisticated understanding of cosmic balance that was characteristic of Norse thought. The same serpent whose awakening will destroy the world is also the creature whose presence maintains the world's stability. His coils hold the oceans in place and prevent them from spilling into the cosmic void, while his breathing creates the tidal forces that are essential to marine life. Bjorn continues his tale by describing the signs that will herald Jormungandr's awakening. The whales will beach themselves on every shore, driven mad by the poison beginning to seep from the serpent's dream. The tides will become erratic, sometimes failing to come in for days at a time, other times rising far beyond their normal bounds. Ships will report seeing impossible things in the deep waters, cities of coral and bone, forests of kelp that move against the current, and shadows too large to be cast by any natural creature. These signs were not merely poetic invention, but reflected genuine observations by Norse sailors who spent their lives at sea. They had noted the behavioral changes in marine life that often preceded major storms or seismic events, and they attributed these phenomena to the world serpent's restless sleep. Modern science might explain such observations as responses to changing water temperature, magnetic field fluctuations, or subsonic vibrations, but the underlying truth remains the same. The ocean is full of mysteries that we have only begun to understand. The concept of Jormungandr also influenced Norse attitudes toward the sea itself. Unlike cultures that viewed the ocean as a highway or a source of resources, the Norse understood it as a living entity with its own will and consciousness. Consciousness embodied in the world serpent who dwelt in its depths. This perspective demanded a relationship of respect and reciprocity, rather than simple exploitation. Sailors would pour ale into the waves before beginning a journey, not as mere superstition, but as acknowledgement that they were entering the domain of a conscious being whose cooperation was necessary for their survival. They understood that the sea could be both sustainer and destroyer, and that their relationship with it must be maintained through proper ritual and respect. As Bjorn's tale draws toward its conclusion, he addresses the deeper meaning behind the world serpent myth. Jormungandr teaches us that the forces which sustain us and those which threaten us are often one and the same, he says, his aged face solemn in the firelight. The serpent who holds our world together will also be the instrument of its destruction. This is the nature of existence itself, that creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. This philosophical insight reflects the Norse understanding that all things contain within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. The gods who create order also carry within them the potential for chaos. The heroes who defend civilization also possess the capacity for violence that could destroy it. And the ocean that sustains all life on Earth also holds the power to reclaim everything it has given.
Modern encounters with the world serpent, according to Bjorn, are rare but not unknown. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, when the aurora burns bright across the sky, sailors in the deep waters report seeing a curve of scale and flesh breaking the surface in the distance. Too large to be a whale, too serpentine to be any natural creature, these are glimpses of Jormungandr's coils as he shifts in his eternal slumber, reminders that the end of all things lies sleeping beneath the waves. Such sightings, dismissed by skeptics as misidentified whales or tricks of light and perspective, take on different significance when viewed through the lens of Norse cosmology. They represent encounters with the mythic dimension of reality, moments when the mundane world becomes transparent and reveals the underlying cosmic forces that shape existence. The influence of the world serpent legend extends far beyond Scandinavian culture. Similar motifs appear in mythologies around the world. The rainbow serpent of Aboriginal Australian tradition, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerican cultures, and the great dragon that encircles the world in various European traditions. This widespread occurrence suggests that the image of a world serpent addresses fundamental human concerns about the nature of existence and our place within the cosmic order. As the fire dies down in Bjorn's longhouse and the warriors prepare to seek their beds, the old skald offers one final observation. Remember this. Brave ones, when you sail upon the whale road and feel the deep currents moving beneath your keel, you are feeling the breath of Jormungandr himself. Show proper respect, for you travel through the domain of a creature whose power dwarfs that of kings and gods alike. And remember too that the serpent's awakening is not something to be feared, but something to be prepared for. Ragnarok is not merely an ending, but a cleansing, a chance for the world to be born anew. When Jormungandr rises from the depths and the final battle begins, it will mark not just the death of the old world, but the birth of a new one. A world where the survivors of the catastrophe can build something better from the ashes of what came before. This cyclical view of existence, embodied in the world serpent's role in both maintaining and destroying the current cosmic order, represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of Norse mythology. Rather than viewing good and evil as absolute categories, it recognizes that all things exist within an eternal cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction that gives meaning to existence itself. The legend of Jormungandr continues to resonate in our modern world, where we face our own version of cosmic threats, climate change, nuclear war, ecological collapse, that, like the world serpent, are both products of our own actions and forces that could destroy everything we have built. The myth reminds us that our greatest threats often emerge from the very systems that sustain us, and that wisdom lies in understanding the cyclical nature of existence, rather than believing that any particular order can be maintained forever. Now let us leave the cold waters where Jormungandr sleeps, and travel to warmer seas, where a different kind of terror awaits, one born not of cosmic forces, but of very human fears about the unknown depth. Beneath the crystal-clear waters of the Caribbean, where coral reefs paint the sea floor in brilliant colors and tropical fish dance in schools that flash like living rainbows, There exist portals to another world entirely. These are the blue holes, perfectly circular caverns that plunge into the earth with depths that seem to have no end. Their dark waters hiding secrets that predate human civilization by millions of years. It is in these mysterious depths that we encounter the Luska, a creature that combines the tentacled horror of an octopus with the intelligence of something far more ancient and malevolent. Unlike the cosmic threats we have explored in northern waters, the Luska represents a more intimate terror, the fear of what might be lurking just beneath the surface of paradise itself. Let us journey to the year 1692. 3 months before the great earthquake that would send the pirate haven of Port Royal sliding into the sea. Our setting is the island of Andros in the Bahamas, where Captain Isabella Vasquez commands the Spanish treasure galleon Santa Esperanza. She is a woman of remarkable courage and skill, one of the few female captains in the Caribbean, having earned her commission through a combination of noble birth, exceptional seamanship, and the simple fact that she had proven more capable than most men at keeping her crew alive in these treacherous waters. Captain Vasquez is not on a mission of conquest or piracy, but of exploration. The Spanish crown, ever hungry for new sources of wealth, has charged her with investigating reports of unusual underwater formations near Andros Island, formations that local natives claim hide vast chambers filled with gold left by ancient civilization. Standing on the deck of her ship as it anchors in the shallow waters of the tongue of the ocean, Isabella studies the charts spread before her with the critical eye of someone who has learned not to trust maps drawn by men who have never set foot in the places they claim to know. The local Lucayan guides she has employed speak in hushed tones of the blue holes that dot this region, their warnings carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom. "Captain," says Chief Kazik, the eldest of her native guides, his weathered face marked by decades of sun and salt. "The holes in the sea floor, they are not natural caves. They are doorways to the realm of the water spirit, places where the boundary between our world and the spirit world grows thin." Isabella, a practical woman of the Enlightenment despite her Spanish Catholic upbringing, initially dismisses such talk as primitive superstition, but as her ship moves over one of the smaller blue holes, she cannot deny the unsettling effect it has on both her crew and the sea life around. Fish that had been abundant in the surrounding waters seem to avoid the circular opening entirely, and even the normally fearless Caribbean sharks give it a wide berth. The blue hole itself is a marvel that challenges the understanding of even experienced mariners. From the surface it appears as a perfect circle of deep blue water, perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded by the lighter turquoise of the shallow banks. But as Isabella peers over the side of her ship, she realizes that this circle is not merely a patch of deeper water, but an opening into something that seems to have no bottom at all. "Madre de Dios," whispers her first mate, Carlos Mendoza, crossing himself as he stares into the abyss. "How deep does it go?" The answer, according to modern scientific exploration, is that many of these blue holes extend hundreds of feet, straight down into the limestone bedrock of the Bahamas, creating underwater caverns of cathedral-like proportion. But to Isabella and her crew, armed only with weighted lines and primitive diving bells, the blue holes might as well extend to the center of the earth itself. As they prepare to begin their exploration, strange things begin to happen around the ship. The water near the blue hole takes on an oily quality that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet beneath the surface, despite the notorious clarity of Bahamian waters. More unsettling still, objects dropped into the hole, stones, pieces of wood, even a small barrel, seem to disappear, not with the steady sinking one would expect, but in a quick, jerky motion, as if something below were actively pulling them down. It is Chief Kazik who first speaks the name that will haunt Isabella's dreams for the rest of her life. "Luska," he says, the word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The many-armed one who guards the entrances to the underwater realm. She is ancient beyond measure, older than the coral reefs, older perhaps than the islands themselves. According to Lucayan tradition, the Luska is far more than a simple sea monster. She is described as a creature of immense intelligence and supernatural power, capable of changing her size at will and moving through underwater passages with impossible speed. Her tentacles, covered in suckers lined with needle-sharp teeth, can extend for hundreds of feet, allowing her to snatch prey from the surface, while her body remains hidden in the deepest parts of the blue hole. But it is not just the creature's physical capabilities that make her so feared. The Luska is said to possess a form of hypnotic power,
able to draw victims into the water through mental compulsion rather than physical force. Sailors who stare too long into the dark waters of a blue hole often report hearing voices calling to them from the depths, sometimes the voices of loved ones, sometimes completely unknown speakers, whose words nonetheless seem irresistibly compelling. As Isabella's crew begins their first attempt at exploration using a primitive diving bell, they quickly discover that the blue hole's depths hold horrors that their imaginations had not prepared them for. The limestone walls of the cavern are covered with what initially appears to be coral growth, but closer examination reveals something far more disturbing: the calcified remains of countless sea creatures, from tiny fish to massive marine mammals, all trapped in poses that suggest they had been fleeing from something when death overtook them. "Captain," reports the diver when he is hauled back to the surface, his face pale and his hands shaking, "there are chambers down there, rooms larger than cathedrals connected by passages that seem to go on forever. And the walls, Dios mío, the walls are covered with bones. But it is not the bone-lined chambers that prove most unsettling. It is the evidence of intelligence behind their arrangement." The diver describes seeing the skeletal remains organized in patterns that suggest ritual significance, arranged in spirals and geometric designs that speak of a mind capable of artistic expression and symbolic thought. As the exploration continues over the following days, Isabella and her crew begin to experience the psychological effects that have made the blue holes legendary among Caribbean sailors. Crew members report dreams of swimming through endless underwater corridors lined with eyes that watch their passage with predatory intelligence. Others wake to find themselves standing at the ship's rail, staring down into the blue hole with no memory of how they came to be there. The native guides become increasingly agitated as these incidents multiply. Chief Kazik warns Isabella that the Lusca is awakening to their presence, testing their defenses and probing for weaknesses that can be exploited. She does not attack immediately, he explains, his eyes never leaving the dark water of the blue hole. First she learns. She watches and listens and comes to understand her prey. Only when she knows exactly how to break them does she strike. This description aligns with historical accounts of blue hole encounters throughout the Caribbean. Survivors often report a period of increasing psychological pressure before any physical manifestation of the creature occurs. Nightmares that seem too vivid to be mere dreams, compulsions to enter the water despite rational fear, and the persistent feeling of being watched by something vast and patient. The scientific explanation for such phenomena might involve the unusual acoustics of underwater caverns, infrasound that affects the human brain in ways that produce feelings of unease and paranoia, or perhaps electromagnetic anomalies created by the unique geological formation. But for Isabella and her crew faced with experiences that challenge their understanding of reality itself, such explanations would have provided little comfort. On the fifth day of their exploration, the Lusca finally reveals herself. It begins with a change in the water's color and consistency around the blue hole. What had been merely dark blue becomes an oily black that seems to absorb light rather than reflecting it. The sea around the Santa Esperanza grows unnaturally still, as if some massive presence below has caused every living thing to flee the area. Then from the depths of the blue hole comes a sound unlike anything in nature, a low-frequency vibration that is felt as much as heard, seeming to emanate not from any specific direction but from the water itself. It carries with it an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose, as if something enormous is announcing its presence to those who have dared to intrude upon its domain. "All hands on deck," Isabella commands, her voice cutting through the supernatural silence that has settled over the ship. "Prepare to make sail." But even as her crew rushes to their stations, tentacles begin to emerge from the blue hole, not the relatively small arms of a common octopus, but appendages as thick as ship's masts and covered with suckers the size of dinner plates. Each sucker is lined with rows of curved teeth that gleam like ivory in the tropical sunlight, and the skin between them pulsates with bioluminescent patterns that seem to shift and change with hypnotic regularity. The first tentacle to break the surface moves with surprising gentleness, almost delicately exploring the underside of the Santa Esperanza's hull. Isabella realizes that the creature is not yet attacking but rather investigating, learning the dimensions and construction of the ship with the thoroughness of a craftsman examining a new tool. "She's testing our defenses," Chief Kazik murmurs, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and fascination, "feeling for weak points, learning how we respond to her touch. This is how the Lusca hunts, with patience and intelligence. Indeed, the creature's behavior suggests a level of tactical thinking that exceeds that of any known marine predator. Rather than striking immediately with overwhelming force, she appears to be gathering information about her potential prey, perhaps even evaluating whether the ship and its crew represent a threat worth the effort of elimination. As more tentacles emerge from the blue hole, Isabella and her crew get their first full sense of the Lusca's true side. The appendages that have broken the surface appear to be only a small fraction of the creature's total bulk, suggesting that the main body remains hidden in the deepest parts of the cavern system. Estimates of size become meaningless when dealing with something that clearly extends far beyond the visible portions, but sailors' accounts describe tentacles that could wrap around the largest ships multiple times. The creature's intelligence becomes more apparent as she begins to interact with the ship in ways that suggest she understands its function and vulnerabilities. One tentacle carefully examines the anchor chain, following it down to where it disappears into the blue hole's depth. Another explores the ship's rudder with what appears to be scientific curiosity, testing its range of motion and the materials from which it is constructed.
Most unsettling of all, several tentacles rise above the water's surface and seem to study the crew directly. The suckers along these appendages dilate and contract in patterns that suggest the creature is somehow tasting or analyzing the air around the humans, gathering information about their biology and emotional state through senses that have no equivalent in terrestrial life. "She's learning about us," Isabella whispers to Carlos, her hand unconsciously moving to the crucifix at her throat, "learning what we are, how we think, what we fear." This assessment proves accurate as the Lusca begins to exhibit behavior that can only be described as psychological warfare. The tentacles start to move in patterns that seem designed to induce specific responses in the watching humans, slow, hypnotic undulations that draw the eye and make it difficult to look away, sudden quick movements that trigger startle responses, and delicate touches to the ship that create small vibrations throughout the hull. Several crew members begin to show signs of the compulsion that Caribbean sailors have long associated with blue hole encounters. They move toward the ship's rail as if drawn by invisible strings, their eyes fixed on the dark water below with an expression of dreamy fascination. Only the quick intervention of their shipmates prevents them from throwing themselves overboard. The song, Chief Kazik says urgently. "Can you hear the song?" She's calling to them, drawing them down to join the others in her bone chambers. Isabella strains her ears but can detect only the normal sounds of wind and wave. Yet she cannot deny that something is affecting her crew in ways that go beyond simple fear. The men who are being drawn toward the water wear expressions of blissful anticipation, as if they are being offered something infinitely desirable rather than being lured to their deaths. This aspect of the Lusca legend, her ability to compel victims to enter the water voluntarily, represents one of the most terrifying elements of the myth. Unlike monsters that rely purely on physical force, the Lusca is said to understand the deepest desires and fears of human psychology, using that knowledge to make her prey complicit in their own destruction. The standoff continues for what feels like hours but is probably only minutes. The Lusca continues her examination of ship and crew while Isabella desperately tries to formulate a plan of escape. The creature has not yet shown overtly hostile behavior, but her very presence represents a threat that could become deadly at any moment. It is Chief Kazik who provides the key to their salvation, though his solution requires a sacrifice that will haunt Isabella for the rest of her life. From his belt he removes a carved jade figurine, a representation of the water spirit that his people have used for centuries to communicate with the entities that dwell in the blue holes. "She must be offered something of value," he explains, his voice heavy with the weight of inevitable loss. "Something that carries meaning, that represents true sacrifice. Only then will she consider allowing us to leave her domain unharmed." The figurine, Isabella learns, is not merely valuable in monetary terms, but represents the accumulated spiritual power of Kazik's lineage, a connection to the water spirits that has been maintained by his family for generations. To sacrifice it means severing that connection forever, leaving his descendants without the protection that has allowed them to navigate Caribbean waters safely. But faced with the alternative, almost certain death for everyone aboard the Santa Esperanza, Kazik makes the choice without hesitation. He kisses the jade figurine once, whispers what sounds like a prayer or farewell in his native language, and then drops it into the dark water of the blue hole. The effect is immediate and dramatic. The Luska's tentacles freeze in mid-motion, as if the creature is suddenly focused on something far more important than the Spanish ship and its crew. Then, with movements that suggest something approaching reverence, the tentacles withdraw toward the blue hole, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. The water around the Santa Esperanza returns to its normal crystalline clarity, and the usual sounds of Caribbean sea life resume as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. But Isabella knows that she and her crew have been fundamentally changed by their encounter with something that exists beyond the normal boundaries of the natural world. In her ship's log, discovered years later in the archives of Seville, Isabella wrote, "We have encountered something in these waters that challenges everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The natives speak of spirits and supernatural creatures, and I find that I can no longer dismiss such talk as mere superstition. There are depths in the ocean that hide more than fish and coral. They hide truths that perhaps were never meant for human understanding." The legend of the Luska continues to influence Caribbean culture to this day, serving as both warning and explanation for the mysterious properties of the blue holes that dot the region. Modern scientific exploration has revealed that these formations are indeed connected by vast underwater cave systems, some of which extend for miles beneath the sea floor. The caves contain environments unlike anything else on Earth. Underwater chambers where fresh water floats above salt water in distinct layers, creating conditions that have preserved ecosystems unchanged for millions of years. Some of these chambers contain stalactites and stalagmites that could only have formed when the caves were above sea level, suggesting that they are far older than current sea levels would indicate. But science has also uncovered evidence that gives new credence to some aspects of the Luska legend. The blue holes do indeed contain the remains of creatures that appear to have been organized in patterns that suggest intelligence, though whether by human agency, unknown marine life, or natural processes remains a subject of debate. More intriguingly, several blue holes have acoustic properties that could explain the song that draws victims into the water. Sound waves generated by tidal action and current flow can create infonic frequencies that affect human brain function, potentially producing the compulsive behavior and altered mental states described in historical accounts. The Luska represents more than just another sea monster. She embodies the fear of the unknown that lies beneath familiar surfaces. The Caribbean, for all its reputation as a tropical paradise, remains largely unexplored beneath the waves. The blue holes serve as reminders that even in our modern age of satellite mapping and deep-sea exploration, there are still places on Earth where the mysterious and inexplicable hold sway. The creature also symbolizes the price of intrusion into realms where humans do not belong. Unlike some sea monsters that attack without provocation, the Luska is typically described as responding to human encroachment on her territory. She represents the natural world's capacity for retaliation against those who would exploit its resources without proper respect or understanding. Sound fades to gentle waves lapping against shore. As we leave the crystal waters of the Caribbean and the bone-lined chambers where the Luska keeps her vigil, let us remember the lesson that Captain Isabella learned in those terrifying moments above the blue hole. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, and some depths are too profound for human understanding. The blue holes of the Caribbean continue to attract explorers and scientists, their dark waters hiding secrets that may never be fully revealed. But for those who know the legends, who understand the price that has been paid for knowledge throughout the ages, they serve as reminders that the ocean's greatest treasures are often guarded by forces that demand respect rather than conquest. Now let us journey to different waters entirely, where the gods of Polynesia have given birth to creatures that embody both the creative and destructive power of the sea itself. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where islands rise like jewels from waters so deep that their bottoms have never known the touch of sunlight, there exists a pantheon of sea creatures born not of human fear but of divine power itself. These are the children of Tangaroa, the great Polynesian god of the sea, beings whose very existence bridges the gap between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. To understand these creatures, we must first understand their divine progenitor. Tangaroa is not merely a god of the sea, but the sea itself made conscious and purposeful. In Polynesian cosmology, he represents one of the fundamental forces of creation, the primordial waters from which all life emerged and to which all life must eventually return. Let us journey to the year 1421. Nearly a century before European explorers would discover the Pacific Islands,
to witness an encounter between mortals and the divine that would shape Polynesian maritime culture for generations to come. Our setting is the open ocean between Tahiti and the Marquesas, where a great fleet of voyaging canoes struggles against storms that seem to possess malevolent intelligence. Leading this fleet is Master Navigator Kahanui, whose knowledge of wind and wave, star and current, has guided his people safely across thousands of miles of open ocean. His magnificent double-hulled voyaging canoe, Hokulea's Pride, carries not just passengers and supplies, but the accumulated wisdom of generations of seafaring peoples. But on this voyage, something is different. The usual patterns of weather and current that Kahanui has relied upon throughout his career seem to be deliberately working against him. Storms appear from clear skies with no warning, currents flow in directions that contradict all logic, and the stars themselves seem to have shifted in their courses. Master calls his apprentice, Keani, a young man whose skill at reading the sea's moods rivals that of navigators twice his age. The water ahead, it moves in ways I have never seen. Kahanui follows his student's gaze and feels the familiar chill that comes when the natural world behaves in ways that challenge human understanding. The ocean's surface, which should be uniform in its response to wind and current, instead shows patterns that suggest the presence of something massive moving beneath the waves, something with intelligence and purpose. According to Polynesian tradition, such phenomena indicate the presence of one of Tangaroa's children, divine beings who embody specific aspects of the sea god's power and personality. Unlike the monsters of European mythology, these creatures are not inherently evil or destructive. They are, instead, expressions of the ocean's dual nature as both sustainer and destroyer, creator and consumer. As Kahanui's fleet draws closer to the disturbance, the true nature of what they face becomes apparent. Rising from the depths comes a creature so immense that its emergence causes whirlpools to form across miles of ocean surface. This is Te Wekea Maturangi, the great octopus whose tentacles are said to be capable of reaching from one island to another. But this is no ordinary cephalopod magnified to impossible size. Te Wekea Maturangi possesses the divine intelligence of his father Tangaroa, and his body shows characteristics that mark him as a being of supernatural origin. His skin shifts through colors that have no names in human language, and patterns of bioluminescence play across his surface in designs that seem to tell stories of creation and destruction, of the endless cycle of birth and death that governs all existence. Most striking of all are his eyes, vast orbs that reflect not just the light of the sun, but seem to contain galaxies of stars, as if each pupil were a window into the cosmic depths where Tangaroa dwells in eternal contemplation of his oceanic domain. He is testing us, Kahanui tells his crew, his voice carrying the authority of one who has spent his lifetime learning to read the sea's mood. Tangaroa's son wishes to know if we are worthy to pass through his domain, or if we are merely another group of mortals who believe they can traverse the ocean without understanding its true nature. This concept, that encounters with divine sea creatures are tests rather than attacks, represents a fundamental difference between Polynesian and European maritime tradition. Where European sailors saw monsters to be fought or fled from, Polynesian navigators understood such encounters as opportunities to demonstrate their understanding of the ocean's deeper rhythms and their respect for the forces that governed their floating world. The test begins not with physical confrontation but with a challenge to Kahanui's knowledge and wisdom. Te Wekea Maturangi's tentacles begin to move in patterns that mirror the currents of the deep ocean, creating a kind of three-dimensional map of the underwater geography that lies beneath the fleet's path. The message is clear: to pass safely, the navigator must demonstrate that he understands not just the surface conditions, but the deeper forces that shape the sea's behavior. Kahanui responds by directing his fleet to adjust their formation and heading in ways that complement rather than fight the patterns being created by the divine octopus. This is the essence of Polynesian navigation, not the conquest of natural forces, but the harmonious cooperation with them. As the hours pass, the test becomes more complex. Te Wekea Maturangi creates artificial currents and wind patterns that challenge every aspect of Kahanui's seamanship. But with each challenge successfully met, the creature's demeanor seems to grow more approving, his bioluminescent displays taking on patterns that Kahanui recognizes as expressions of divine satisfaction. The climax of the test comes when Teweke Muturangi suddenly disappears beneath the waves, leaving the fleet floating in water so calm it resembles polished glass. But Kahanui knows that this is not the end but the beginning of the most difficult part of the trial. Somewhere beneath them, the divine creature is preparing something that will challenge not just their navigation skills, but their spiritual understanding. When Teweke Muturangi resurfaces, he has been joined by others of his kind, a pod of divine octopi, whose combined presence creates effects that border on the miraculous. The water around the fleet begins to glow with phosphorescence, so intense that it rivals the light of day, and schools of fish appear in formations that seem to spell out messages in languages that predate human speech. "Look," cries Keoweni, pointing toward the horizon. The sky above them, the aurora, a phenomenon that should be impossible at this latitude, begins to dance across the tropical sky in colors that mirror the bioluminescent displays of the creatures below. This is a sign that the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the gods
become thin, allowing divine power to manifest in ways that challenge human understanding of natural law. In this moment of cosmic alignment, Teweke Muturangi begins to communicate directly with Kahanui, not through words or even telepathy, but through a direct transfer of understanding that bypasses the limitations of language entirely. The navigator suddenly comprehends secrets of the ocean that no human has ever known. The location of underwater mountains that serve as resting places for divine beings, the existence of currents that flow not just through water but through time itself, and the true nature of the relationship between the sea and the sky. But with this knowledge comes responsibility. Teweke Muturangi makes it clear that such understanding is not given freely, but comes with obligations that will shape the rest of Kahanui's life. He must serve as a guardian of the sacred knowledge, sharing it only with those who have proven themselves worthy through demonstrated respect for the ocean and its inhabitants. The divine octopus also reveals the existence of his siblings, other children of Tangaroa, who guard different aspects of the oceanic realm. There is Kanaloa Kahulua, the great squid whose ink can create storms that last for months, Kahuhu, the shark god whose presence can calm the most violent seas, and many others, each embodying a different facet of their father's infinite power. These revelations transform Kahanui's understanding not just of navigation, but of the ocean itself. He comes to realize that the Pacific is not merely a body of water to be crossed, but a living entity populated by conscious beings whose cooperation is essential for human survival in the maritime environment. As the encounter draws to its close, Teweke Muturangi performs one final act that demonstrates the benevolent aspect of divine power. His tentacles reach deep into the ocean and emerge carrying gifts for the fleet, pearls of sizes that defy belief, shells that sing with the voices of the sea, and coral formations that seem to contain entire ecosystems in miniature. But the greatest gift is knowledge itself. Through his connection with the divine octopus, Kahanui gains understanding of navigation techniques that allow him to read the sea's moods with unprecedented accuracy. He learns to recognize the subtle signs that indicate the presence of divine beings, and more importantly, how to approach such encounters with the proper respect and humility. The immediate effects of this encounter extend far beyond a single voyage. When Kahanui's fleet reaches its destination, word of the divine encounter spreads throughout Polynesian maritime culture. The knowledge gained from Teweke Muturangi becomes part of the sacred lore passed down from master navigator to apprentice, shaping the way Polynesian peoples understand their relationship with the ocean for generations to come. But the encounter also establishes a precedent for future interactions between humans and Tangaroa's children. These divine beings are revealed to be not monsters to be feared, but teachers, whose tests, while challenging, are designed to elevate human understanding rather than simply punish presumption. This philosophical approach to sea monsters reflects the broader Polynesian worldview, which sees the natural world as populated by conscious entities with whom humans must maintain proper relationship. The ocean is not a resource to be exploited but a community to be joined, with its own rules, customs and expectations for behavior. Modern encounters with unusual marine life in Polynesian waters are still sometimes interpreted through this traditional lens. Unusually large octopi, squid, or other cephalopods are regarded with special reverence, particularly if they display behavior that suggests intelligence beyond normal animal instinct. Scientists studying the waters around Polynesian islands have indeed discovered cephalopods of unusual size and apparent intelligence, though whether these represent unknown species or simply exceptional individuals of known species remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that the Pacific Ocean, with its tremendous depths and largely unexplored underwater ecosystems, continues to yield surprises that challenge our understanding of marine biology. The legend of Tefwike Muterangi and his divine siblings serves as more than just colorful mythology. It represents a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between humans and the marine environment, one that emphasizes cooperation rather than conquest, respect rather than exploitation, and humility rather than arrogance. In our modern age of industrial fishing and ocean pollution, the wisdom embedded in these ancient stories takes on new relevance. The Polynesian concept of the ocean as a community of conscious beings offers an alternative to the Western view of the sea as merely a resource to be exploited or a highway to be traversed. As climate change and human activity continue to alter the marine environment in ways that we are only beginning to understand, perhaps it is time to consider the possibility that our relationship with the ocean requires the kind of respect and reciprocity that Kahanui demonstrated in his encounter with Tefwike Muterangi. The children of Tangaroa remind us that the sea is not merely a backdrop for human activity, but a realm with its own intelligence, its own purposes, and its own requirements for how visitors should behave within its domain. To ignore these requirements is to court disaster. To honor them is to discover that the ocean can be not just a source of sustenance, but a teacher whose lessons extend far beyond navigation to encompass the deepest truths about existence itself. Now let us leave the warm waters of Polynesia and journey to one of the coldest and most forbidding marine environments on Earth, where creatures born of ice and legend wait beneath the frozen sea. In the frozen wasteland of the Arctic Ocean, where the boundary between sea and land becomes meaningless beneath layers of ice that stretch to the horizon, there exists a terror that strikes at the heart of humanity's most primal fear, the threat to our children. Here, in waters so cold that exposure means death within minutes, dwells the colossal, creatures whose very existence serves as both warning and explanation for the countless dangers that await the unwary in one of Earth's most hostile environments. To understand the colossal, one must first understand the world they inhabit, a realm where survival depends not on individual strength, but on the accumulated wisdom of generations, where a moment's carelessness can mean death, not just for oneself, but for entire families dependent on each hunter's success. Let us journey to the year 1847, during the height of the Little Ice Age, when Arctic conditions were even more severe than those we know today. Our story unfolds in a small Inuit settlement on the shores of what Europeans would later name Baffin Bay, where the sun disappears for months at a time and the aurora borealis provides the only light in a world of eternal winter. In this harsh landscape we encounter Siku, a master hunter whose skill at reading ice conditions and tracking prey has kept her extended family alive through winters that claimed entire settlements elsewhere. She is a woman of perhaps 30 years, though the Arctic ages people quickly and her face already bears the weathered marks of someone who has spent decades confronting nature at its most unforgiving. On this particular day, as she prepares to lead a hunting expedition onto the sea ice in search of seals, Siku must make a decision that every Arctic parent faces, whether to bring her 8-year-old daughter Nayeli on the hunt or leave her behind in the relative safety of the settlement. Nayeli possesses the quick intelligence and natural instincts that mark her as a potential master hunter herself, and Siku knows that the child's education cannot be delayed simply because of danger. In the Arctic, knowledge is survival, and those who are not taught the sea's ways early often do not live long enough to learn them through experience. But the omens on this day are troubling. The old women of the settlement speak in hushed tones of strange sounds beneath the ice, scratching and scraping that suggests the presence of something that should not exist in these frozen waters. The aurora the previous night displayed colors that the elders claim herald the awakening of things better left sleeping. Most concerning of all, several children from neighboring settlements have vanished over the past few weeks, not taken by bears or lost to accidents, but simply disappeared from places where such disappearances should be impossible. The search parties found no tracks, no blood, no signs of struggle. The children were simply gone.
The Kalapalik are hunting, old grandmother Tuki whispers as she helps Siku prepare her hunting gear. Her voice carries the weight of 8 decades spent in the Arctic, and her milky eyes seem to look through the present into memories of encounters that younger generations prefer to dismiss as legend. Grandmother, Siku replies with the gentle respect due to elders, the Kalapalik are stories we tell to keep children from wandering too close to open water. Surely you don't believe? Child Tuki interrupts, her voice taking on the authority of absolute truth. I have seen them. In the year of the Great Ice Breakup, when I was younger than your Nayeli is now, I watched them take my cousin Milik from the edge of a breathing hole. The creatures are real, and they are hungry. Sound of wind through ice formations with an underlying note of something moving in water. The Kalapalik, according to Inuit tradition, are humanoid sea creatures perfectly adapted to life beneath the Arctic ice. They possess the intelligence of humans but the physiology necessary to survive in conditions that would kill most warm-blooded creatures within minutes. Their skin is said to be green as sea ice, covered with scales that provide both warmth and protection from the sharp edges of broken ice. But it is their hands that mark them as truly alien, equipped with long webbed fingers tipped with claws capable of cutting through ice or flesh with equal ease. These hands allow them to move through underwater ice caves with the agility of seals while maintaining the manipulative ability necessary for their most terrifying characteristic, the kidnapping of human children. The Kalapalik are not mindless predators but intelligent beings with complex motivations that make them far more dangerous than simple animals. According to legend, they kidnap children not for food but for companionship, taking them to underwater cities built within air-filled ice caverns, where the stolen children are transformed into Kalapalik themselves. This aspect of the myth reflects one of the deepest fears of Arctic peoples, that their children might be lost not just to death, but to a transformation that would make them alien to their own family. In a culture where kinship and community are essential for survival, the idea of losing children to creatures that would make them into something other than human represents the ultimate horror. As Siku and Nayeli make their way across the sea ice toward the hunting grounds, both mother and daughter remain alert for signs of Kalapalik presence. The creatures are said to create breathing holes through even the thickest ice, leaving perfectly circular openings that remain unfrozen even in the coldest weather. More ominously, they are credited with the ability to move through the ice itself, traveling through natural caves and crevices to appear suddenly in places where their presence should be impossible. The hunt begins well, with Siku locating a seal's breathing hole and settling into the patient vigil that Arctic hunting requires. But as they wait in the eternal twilight of Arctic winter, Nayeli begins to exhibit behavior that fills her mother with growing alarm. "Mama," the child whispers, her voice carrying a dreamy quality that Siku has never heard before. "Do you hear the singing?" Siku strains her ears but detects only the normal sounds of the Arctic wind across ice, the distant crack of thermal expansion, the occasional call of an Arctic fox. But Nayeli continues to stare toward a section of ice that appears no different from any other, her expression one of rapt fascination. "The lady in the water," Nayeli continues, her voice growing more distant. "She says she has toys for me, games we can play together. She says she's lonely and wants a friend." The blood in Siku's veins turns colder than the Arctic air as she recognizes the signs described in the oldest story. The Kalapalik do not simply snatch children randomly. They select their victims carefully, studying them from hiding places beneath the ice, learning their personalities and desires before beginning the psychological seduction that makes the children complicit in their own kidnapping. Nayeli, Siku says urgently, grabbing her daughter's arm, "Look at me. Look only at me. Do not listen to any voices you may hear from the water." But it may already be too late. Even as Siku tries to lead her daughter away from the breathing hole, the ice beneath their feet begins to show signs of stress that have nothing to do with their weight or movement. Cracks appear in patterns too regular to be natural, radiating outward from points where something beneath the ice is applying pressure from below. The legends speak of the Kalapalik's supernatural strength, their ability to break through ice thick enough to support a full-grown polar bear. But more dangerous than their physical capabilities is their understanding of human psychology, particularly the psychology of children who crave adventure and attention. She said,